Okay, I think we're live. So as I was saying earlier, we're going to be learning about CSS Grid. We're going to learn why is it a layout tool that will allow us to control where the content appears in our website, and why would we want to use them. We're going to get to see what it is, the basic elements that constitute a grid, and basic grid functions that we have. So some of the keywords that we're going to be looking at are rows and columns, grid, and what responsive means, and especially in this context of a CSS grid. So again, CSS Grid was added in 2017 to the CSS standard, and it's not going away. And once something gets adapted into CSS, it's pretty much forever. I don't foresee anything else replacing CSS in the near future. And CSS Grid was put in the standard CSS because there was no way to, or the ways that we used to lay out websites in the past where we wanted literally a grid was to draw, to basically have a table, an HTML table with cells and rows, and then put, let's say we want, let's look at this, table layout web. Here, let's say we want this website. We want a website that has that header with the website name, menu, content area, and then a footer. Right. So the way that we used to do this was with a table that has 1, 2, 3 rows, and then 1, 2, 3 columns, and then that will allow us to lay out this content as it appears here. The problem with a table is that then you'll have to, if you want that, if this website now is being seen on a phone, then you have to write media queries to say how many columns that table is going to have now that is on a smaller screen. Right? And that'll be just more code and more work for the web developer. And on top of that, it was really hard to say this element spans from the first column to the third column, or from the first row to the fourth row. That was generally hard. Therefore, the creators of CSS, the people who developed the standard, saw that as a pain point for developers and for adoption of, or for basically taking the web to the next step, and then they decided to include in the new standard CSS Grid, just to make our lives easier, to also make responsive web design easier to do as well. So as its name indicates, it's basically a grid. We are able to put rows and columns. And let's take a look at some of those. So in the lesson, you will have some HTML. I'm just going to take that, copy this to a file. I'm going to create a folder here in my Unit 2 called CSS Grid. And then I'm going to create 2 files, one for my HTML and another one for a CSS. Grid.html and grid.css. Touching 2 files, and then I'm just going to open this entire folder with my text editor. Cool. And then we have the 2 files. So I'm going to paste my HTML code here. Oh, I also forgot about people in the stream cannot see my mouse, so I need this thing. And I think that's it. Yeah. Okay, so everyone has this code now. It's in the lesson, the first HTML code that you see in the lesson. So I'm not going to write any CSS just yet. Let's look at what this website looks like in the browser as is. Open HTML. And we have this. And not very interesting website with what seems to be some divs. So let's look at the HTML code. We had our HTML with a head. We're linking a CSS file. And then we have a body with a bunch of divs inside, 9 divs. And it seems that we have an outer div that we call a container. Yes. Say that a little bit louder. We didn't go over container because, well, what a container is just any div that you want to call container. And in this case, we just gave that div a class of container, supposedly because there is going to be more than one container. But a container is just it's a name that we, the developers, invented, and it doesn't really mean anything. Or yeah, you could call anything that contains another thing inside, you could call a container, right? But it doesn't have any specific meaning. Does that? Cool. Okay, so we have a div that we call the container. We gave it a class, the container. And then every other div has its own class. 1, 2, 3. At this point, this could perfectly be IDs because remember, when do we want to use classes versus IDs? Douglas?
When you want a class, when you want to use it again, but an ID when it's unique to an individual item.
Correct. Yes, I think the class definition is partially correct, but what you could also say to complement that is you want a class once you want to, when elements in the page share something in common. They will share their size or they will share their text color, etc. So we use classes when we want to share some CSS. IDs when we want to individually target one element. So here, this could have been an ID as well. In fact, I don't think we're gonna get to see more containers. So I'm gonna change this ID to class. Also, this is a nice shortcut once you have in your text editor you want to change multiple words at the same time. So I want to change all the classes. So I double click on the class or the word that I want to change, and then you hit Command D. And you keep going, Command D, until every word that you want is highlighted. And this is what is known as, I think, multi-cursor. Here I could delete. I could type another thing I want, and it's going to be replacing everything. In this case, I want to change all that to be ID. Cool. So I changed all the classes to be ID. Why? Because we're not going to have another container. And this is it's safe to have them uniquely identified. Okay, so that we see that this HTML code just yields this very plain page. And we want to explore the grid and its and what it is, as well as its items. So let's look at, there's some CSS in here. I'm going to take this CSS and paste it on my CSS file. And let's construct what this CSS is doing, what the CSS rule is doing. So who could tell me, who could share with us what kind of selector we're using here? Sibling selector, element. What kind of selector is this rule using? Somebody else. Owen? ID, yes, so this part is an ID, that's correct. What about this part? And so we seem to be combining two selectors, right? The ID and the tag name selector, right? And yes, group. Group selector will have commas, like this. But when we don't have commas and we have just a space, descendant selector, right? So this is saying select all the divs that are descendant of the container. Correct. What about this one? This is descendant, but with a tweak. Child selector, direct child selector. So this will only select the divs that are direct child of the container. So in this case, both will work. But if the descendant selector, just as a refresher, will select not only the direct child, but the grandchild of the element, and so on. Everything that's a child, even though it might not be a direct child. And when we have the greater than sign, it's only the direct child. Cool, so this is putting a border radius of 5 pixels around the corner, adding some padding, setting the background color to light blue and the border to red, 2 pixels solid. So let's look at what our page looks like now. Now that I have saved that, refresh, and we get a more visually appealing but still plain website. Cool. So why are all of the divs on top of each other? Like, why isn't it div 1 next to div 2 on the right? Well, but that's not the question. That's not the question that I'm asking. I'm asking, like, why are they, like, div 1 comes before div 2, and why aren't they laid out in like one line, for instance? Sure. They are block elements, correct. So a block element, what do we know about a block element? It occupies the entire width of the available space. So even if I do this, you see the block element just grows to fill in the available space, right? So we learn about flexbox, and flexbox, if we give the container display flex, all the elements, and we remember that the flex by default will be one row. That will put all of them in one row, right? But now we're going to learn about CSS Grid, right? And then let's look at what happens when I do. So Grid is another value for the display property. What are some other values that we saw yesterday besides Grid, besides flexbox and block and inline? There were some other values that we could give to the display property. Over some of those. So if I want to target only the container, and I want to say display. So what are some of the values that I can give to the display property? What happens if we type in display none? Everything is just gone. What if we try display inline block? Now we get that. They're inline block elements. Now they're no longer block elements, so therefore they're no longer occupying the entire available width, but they're still creating line breaks between them, right? Cool. So just remember, if you forget, well, Visual Studio can help you. because if you do display and then, oops, I think it's because I have a comma. You get this list here that has all of them. Also, if you're playing live in the browser, you also get the same thing when you do inspect. Let's select one of these, or let's select the container rather. And display, you can add another property. Let's just disable that one. And here you also get them all. And you could even, this is the cool thing that you can see them like live. As I scroll down with my arrow, I can see what each one of them will yield. We can see Flex, for instance, put them all on that. Okay, so now let's try Grid. So let me put this back. I'm going to say container display grid. And I refresh my page. And nothing seems to have changed. Right? The only thing that changed is that now my container is no longer a block element, now it's a grid. And we call whatever we specify the display grid property, we call that a grid container. Right? And then we're gonna see what that means. Okay, so first is we didn't see anything change apparently, but if we inspect, we should be able to verify that now this is a grid. So let's go on the container. Now we can see here that by default in the browser style sheet, a div will be a block, right? But now that's crossed out, and we have our rule that is on grid CSS line 8, applying with grid. In fact, I could toggle it. Nothing really seems to change. When I untoggle it, now the display block is applying, etc. Okay, so the purpose of grid is to create rows and columns. That's the entire point. So let's see how we can create some of those. So any questions here so far? So actually, let's do. I prefer to do it like here live, but what do you guys think? Like, should I just do it in the CSS file? Or like, I guess like my question is everyone comfortable with inspecting the element and changing the styles in the browser? Cool. I think the visual live feed that we get from playing with the browser is more fun than having to refresh. I'm going to be copying and pasting anything we do. Okay, so I highlight here my container is display grid, and with display grid, so let's create our first columns. Once we have a grid, we can say grid template columns. And we can say, so grid template columns is another property, a CSS property. It will only apply if the element that you're selecting is display grid. If you try to apply this property to a flexbox or a regular div that's not a grid, it will have no effect. So some values that you can have here is you will specify how many columns do you want and what are their sizes, basically. So I want 2 columns of 200 pixels each one. So we got our first column, and now I want the second column to be 200 pixels wide as well. Let me put this here. And we end up with a grid of 2 columns. You can see that the elements will be laid out left to right. So 1, then 2, 3, 4, etc. Right? It's not like us. We don't have 1 here, 2 here, 3 here. They are laid out horizontally, right? As they in the order that they appear in the HTML markup. As I hover over here. Yes, Lucas.
If you resize it, will it push them down?
That's a good question. If I resize them, nothing really happens. Shar, do you have a question earlier? No, okay. So why do you think it doesn't resize as we did before? Any speculation?
They're not flexible, they're static.
They're not flexible, they're static. That's a good start. So anybody wants to elaborate on that? Yes, Savita?
You said you wanted them to be 200 pixels wide, those columns to be 200 pixels wide, so it's staying at that time.
Correct. So if we combine those two, then we find a word that is that I forgot. Their size, their width is fixed. That's the word that I was looking for. So as Cameron said, static and not flexible. We can say, and with Savita's help, yes, we have this these divs inside of the container will be laid out according to what we say our columns are, right? So we said here that our columns, we want one column to be exactly 200 pixels wide, and another one to be exactly 200 pixels wide. So this is what is known as a fixed width, right? And when you have a fixed width, then the content will not resize as the page changes. So how do we think we could change that? Like, what if we actually want them to be a little bit more flexible so that if they're looking at this website on a phone, you still see the two columns not cut out? Janesh? Auto? Do you mean like here, if I put auto? No, let's look at that. Let's put it on 1, and let's look at what happens. Oh, that's cool. Now one of them is flexible. So we said that the first column to be its width to be auto. Now let's put maybe the second one auto as well. Yeah, that works. Then there is some point here that they can no longer be 2 columns because the text, you cannot shrink the text. But as we got a glimpse when we were doing Flexbox, we could add a media query that says when the screen is this small, then start reducing the text of the size of the text so they will actually fit. Cool, so that's one way. Do we have other ways to have it resize automatically? So what I'm asking is, are there other values here that I can try? Michael? Okay, yes. But that one is a sort of an obscure measure we're going to get to see, I think, later on. Percentage. So you could use percentages on your elements to say, I want this to be 50% of the available space, or I want this to be 30%, and then this other thing to occupy the remaining 70%. Or you could do 30%, 30%, then 40%, etc. So let's try percentages here. What if I still want the same 2 columns and both to be exactly like they work here? What percentage should I try? What percentages should I try here? Let's try something like 10% and auto. Oh, so now this one on the left will be 10% wide of the entire width, right? So we can see that that one is somewhat flexible, but it's flexible only the 10%, right? Or we can even see that this text is like going out. When you get stuff like this is known as overflowing. The content of the div is overflowing the container, basically. That's one of the. It can be quite tricky to deal with those sometimes. So don't feel frustrated if you ever encounter them and how to fix them. Okay, so let's try. We did that. What if we do? Let's do another 10% here, and we get that. So they're occupying 10% of the available space. So even if we do the math, we should be able to, let's say, 500 pixels. So the 10% of 500 pixels, would it be 5? 50? Right. So if we select one of these elements, we can see that it's, see, the width, well, let's sum up 20 plus almost 20 plus on both sides we get 4. Wait, am I missing something here? We say that this box is occupying almost 50. Well, he's saying 42.29. So maybe because we'll need to reduce like the margin that this has here. You see the border has a margin, so if we reduce that, then the math will match. Cool. So let's put it. We saw that other measure on percentages. So here, if we want the same result, we could do 50%. 50% still gets us that flexibility that we want. So now experiment, what happens when one of these is, what happens if you don't distribute the 100 perfectly, the 100%? So experiment with that. Like give one more than 50 and see what you get. So who wants to share what they perceived happening?
There's a bar that remains out of the screen all the time.
Great, correct. So if we put this like 80%, then we'll have part of the rest elements that just goes outside. But basically what we get is the body now stretches to fill in all the content, and we get this scrolling horizontally, right? But then we'll always have to scroll, right? Okay, so there's one more measurement that we could use here, and is very commonly used with Flexbox and Grid. Does anyone knows and want to share what that measurement is? I think you should have seen it in the lesson if you read it. Okay, so I'm just gonna tell you. Is the fraction measurement. So you can say I want the first column to be one fraction, and I want the other column to be 1 fraction as well. And then we get the exact same result. So you can divide the width in fractions and then assign those. What if we do, like I want this, actually experiment with changing 1 fraction to 2 fractions. What do you see? Anybody wants to share what they see? Douglas?
The larger the number, the larger amount of real estate it takes up.
So let's look at that. So here I'm changing from 1 fraction, 2 fractions, 3 fractions. So basically when you're dealing with fractions, what the browser is doing is breaking down everything into the total amount of fractions. So basically in here we have 4 fractions, and we're saying 1 column will take 3, and the other one will take whatever 1 fraction is, right? In this case, that. So, and then if we start to, then they can start to sort of fight. Because if we have 3 and 3 fractions, they're still will be the same as saying 1 and 1 fraction, right? Okay, so now let's do an exercise where, what if I want, let's do this exercise. Make a grid, make this grid have 5 columns where they grow and shrink as we resize the page. So make this grid have 5 columns, still being able to resize themselves as you change the width. Okay, so I see that most of you got it. What would I need to change here? I'm going to add this here. So what would I change here if I want 5 columns? Yes, Vanille? The repeat? We're going to get to that next, but what if we don't have repeat? Brianna? Make 3 more fractions. So we have 2. We just create another one. Another one. Save that. Refresh. Now we have 5 columns. Also, if you inspect here, I want to see if Chrome has improved in this a little bit. But if I inspect, let's see if I click the container, there are those like really faint lines that are like a dotted line that is sort of purple. Do you see it? That just means it's trying to display to you once I hover over here the container all the grid items, right? Where those grid cells are. Chrome didn't used to do that, and I used to use for like understanding this. I used to do with in Firefox. Firefox has a great visualization for the grid. I just want to show you here what it looks like. Inspector, and we can the container, and then here I can highlight the grid. Oh, but it's still showing it almost exactly the same as the other one. Okay. Oh, this section here shows me like I can highlight over the elements and see the grid more clearly. And actually, oh, we could have this to display the line numbers. These line numbers are like basically the divisions between the elements, as I think you're going to get to do in the lab, which is basically the Flexbox Froggy, but for grid. It's called Grid Garden. It's also a game like that, really fun. And then you can get to, with this numbers, you can get to say, I want this item to go from line 1 to line 3, for instance. What else do we have? Oh, I think I forgot about, okay, we're gonna get to see that next. Also, something that I really like about Firefox, and I'm not saying you have to switch or anything, just you could just experiment with it, is that I can leave something highlighted. If I click here, then I can highlight other stuff while still remaining having this container highlighted, which is good as to foreseeing like how changing one element may change the height or width of another one. Which is that having like multiple things highlighted is not possible in Chrome, unfortunately. Okay, so we had this a column, 5 columns, And this is a lot of repetition, right? So we have to repeat ourselves 5 times. So it turns out that CSS, just like JavaScript, has functions. And there's one really handy function that is the repeat function. Just like a JavaScript function, you have to call it with parentheses, and you have to pass in some arguments to it. So the repeat function takes in 2 arguments. One is how many times do you want to repeat, and then what do you want to repeat. So I want to repeat 5 times, and what do I want to repeat? I want to repeat 1 fraction. So I do repeat, comma, 1 fraction, and I get my 5 columns again. Cool. So so that when you find yourself doing a lot of the same stuff, retyping it over and over again, I hope this function will come to mind, and you will use it. So okay, so that's the repeat. Let me see what else am I missing here. Oh, any questions? So we're saying in here, we're saying the container, which is the grid container, have 5 columns, but we're not saying anything about the rows. What do you think is happening with the rows? How is it that we get 2 rows? Even though we didn't say anything about having 2 or more rows. What do you think? Let's just speculate. Dinesh? It wraps automatically? What do you mean by wrapping? Okay, so I think your concept will be from like that definition will apply to Flexbox. But thank you for that. Any other ideas? Yes, Joanne? Yes, so we can use Joanne discovered another property that is grid template rows, and then you can specify how many rows you have, right? We're gonna get to see that one next, Peter.
Since there's only 5 columns, it just automatically puts the next like 6, 7, the following things in the next additional columns as they fit.
Correct. So since there are only 5 columns, if there are more elements than columns, the browser will just create another row automatically. And we can see that it doesn't wrap around because, well, 6 will never go up to the first column, right? So that is what is known as the implicit grid. So when you say display grid, only display grid, the browser created a grid, and it created one grid that by default implicitly is 1 column and however many rows you have elements, basically. So here the browser created an implicit grid, right? But now we want to control that grid, so we want to define an explicit grid, one that we control and have more control over, right? So when we do grid template columns, we are defining the explicit grid by saying have 5 columns, but we're not defining the explicit rows. So by not defining explicitly rows, the browser will just define those implicitly. So those remain as an implicit definition of the rows. So here right now we're explicitly saying grid have 5 columns. And automatically, implicitly, the browser will create 2 rows as that matches or as that is enough for feeding this content, right? So there is let's look at something that will, and I know that that's a concept that I struggle with when I was learning CSS Grid, which is like the implicit versus the explicit, hopefully I have some examples for us that will make it a little bit more clear throughout today. Okay, so if we want to define explicitly the rows, what we could do is grid template rows. And how do you think this will work? Like, what kind of stuff, what kind of value will give, should I give this property? What do you think? Peter? Can we give the same type of value that we gave the template columns? Let's try it out. Let's try it first, like 20 pixels. Oops, that it seems that it made the first row 20 pixels, 30 pixels in this case. If I want to control the second row, let's do the second row 100 pixels. What if I try to add another one? Like, let's do another 100 pixels. So, same measurements. With grid template rows, we're explicitly saying grid have two rows, one that is 30 pixels and the other one, the second one, to be 100 pixels. And now the grid is fully explicitly stated. If we have, let's say, only 30 pixels, we're saying only the first row will be laid out explicitly, the height will be controlled explicitly, and the second row, the browser does it automatically. Therefore, the second row is laid out implicitly. And implicitly, we have the height of this row will be this row will be as high as necessary to fit the content. So if we look at one of those elements, so we can see that the inner content is the text, and then we have the padding that pushes everything or that pushes the border to the outside, and creating some space between the border and the text. Then we have the border, right? So that this box or this row, this second row, will be as high as the content to fit the content. So here we say we are defining the grid to have 5 columns and 1 row explicitly of 30 pixels. The rest, if we don't specify directly, the browser will do it for you, and that's what we call whatever the browser does with your grid that you're not doing yourself is what we call the implicit grid. What if we try fractions? In how many fractions is the grid divided? That will be horizontally. In 3, right? And we're saying the first column to be 2 fractions and the second one to be 1 fraction. Therefore, the first column will be twice as tall as the second one. Now, here's an interesting question. Can we mix the measures? Can we mix like 2 fractions with pixel? Try it out. Okay, were we able to mix the measurements? So if I could do, I want this to be the first column to be, the first row to be 2 fractions and the second to be 200 pixels. I can do that. I could also use repeat here. I wanted to repeat 2 times and to do 200. So each one now becomes, each row becomes 200 pixels high. And what if we say we want the first row to be 30 pixels, the second one 50 pixels, and the third one 70 pixels. So we can see that when the browser is laying stuff implicitly, it just stops once you, like when we do just 30 pixels, right? So the second row will be laid out implicitly, and it will just stop. There is no third row because we don't have enough content for a third row, right? But once we explicitly say what we want, the kind of grid we want, and we lay out the second one explicitly, and we even explicitly state a third one that doesn't even exist, but we do get the space. So even though those spots are empty, the space is made for you. So new elements that come in here in this container, they will be laid out as we see will happen here.
If you have a div that's not influenced by the grid that you're creating for that container, would an empty space push things down?
That's a good question. So the question that Douglas is asking is, if you have a div under this container, would that be moved out to lower? Let's try it. So let's modify this. Edit as HTML. I'm gonna add a div here. Maybe with a p tag, or just a p tag. Save. So we see the p tag seems to be after the grid was laid out, right? Now maybe if we remove the third row that we are not using but still being reserved for us, maybe let's see what happens. I'm gonna remove this one from here. So we saw that, yes, even though we have the empty space, the grid will be reserved. That space will be reserved for new elements that you may or may not want to put there. Okay, so here we're explicitly laying out the. Oh, that's interesting. So when I go on a negative number, we get that. What do you think is going on? What does this suggest about the values that we can put on grid template rows? I mean? Correct. So if you have one measurement that's negative, that makes the entire property invalid. In fact, if I do this, you see, the entire property gets crossed out, saying invalid property value. So it won't ignore the one that's wrong, it will ignore the entire property. That's something I didn't know. We just found out together. Cool. Okay, so we saw that the space is still made. Questions or comments at this point? Why would, yes, Joanne?
We tried putting both the pixels and the fraction. So one was pixels and the other one was fraction.
In here, in the rows? So you put pixels and then fraction here for the second one. And then you get this, which is the first row will be 30 pixels high, and the second one will be 1 fraction high. And if we try to do more fractions, doesn't work, right? So what do you think? Who could speculate as to what is going on here? Cameron?
Seems to be one fraction of the original height or something like that, because there's no other fractions to compare it to. There's no, yeah, it's just a single fraction. It's always 100%.
Correct. So since there is no other fractions to compare it to, this amount will always be like translated to 100%. Right. Now, once we have like another fraction to compare it to, now the entire rule becomes semantically correct, where we now have, the browser will see this and it knows that all of these have to be 100%, right? But it says 1 fraction, and then it says 9 fractions, and it will say, oh, I need to make 1 of these and then 9 of this other space. In this case, 1 fraction and 9 fraction will be like the same as, would it be the same as 10% and 90%? Oh, that's interesting.
Because it's 10% of the length of the top line. Or maybe not actually.
I'm actually not very sure. So let's try to do a Google search here. Grid template row percentage. Let's look at this one. Let's find for percentage. Oh, there is no percent on this page. Percentage is a non-negative percentage value relative to the block size of the grid container. If the size of the grid container depends on the size of its tracks, then the percentage must be treated as auto, intrinsic size. Okay, so I think what this is saying is if the container doesn't have a specific height, I would say no. I think you're correct, Cameron. Let's see if once we disable that rule, the container height changes. So right now the height is 84 pixels and 57. Now let's see if we disable that. It's still 84 and 57. So this is where CSS can get tricky, right? Because what's going on here is the content of this div or this container makes it have this height, 84 pixels, right? But once and that's still true. Once we get that to resize to be 10%, and to have 2 rows, one occupying 10% and the rest occupying 90%. Those will be calculated based on the height of the container. In this case, then we get that grid, which is which is actually weird. We can see that the text in here. So actually, what is some of the stuff that we're seeing here? Who could describe it for us?
I feel like that's coming from the first CSS you had, and also the size of the actual text itself.
Wait, could you explain that a little bit more?
The child container div, like you added some padding and some borders over there.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have the actual size of your text. All that added together is probably the total right there.
Right, correct. So this container is 84 pixels wide because we have padding, we have border, and then we have the text. If we add up all those numbers, we get, and that we have 2 rows of those, then we get 84.57 pixels. And then we're asking the grid to be, the first row to be 10% of that measurement and 90% the second row of that measurement. So what does that tell us about the fractions versus percentages? So we can see that one fraction, if we just have one fraction, we have the one fraction will be as tall as it needs to be, no more, no less. So that's one fraction. And then if we have, the browser calculated a fraction as tall as it needs to be, right? If we have 2 fractions, then that means double as tall as it needs to be. But if we have 9 fractions, then that will be 9 times as tall as it needs to be. Rather than depending on the height of the container, fractions are independent of the height of the container. We could think of them as sort of depending on each other, or like this fraction. One fraction will be as tall or as wide, depending on where you're using it. If you're using it for a height measurement, one fraction will always be as tall as it needs to be. As one fraction will dictate the container or the div to be as tall as it needs to be, right? Or as wide as it needs to be. And then once you introduce a second fraction, then that fraction will be calculated on the earlier fraction. Does that make sense? Cool. So, okay, so let's look at one other property. Let me just copy. Let's just do this one, like 1 fraction and 2 fractions. Let me put this here. Oh, I never changed this. Let's put this to repeat. So I want to do 3 or everything 1 fraction. See what that looks like. Now we have 3 nice columns. Let's put the template rows. I misspelled the first one.
The second, the third.
So what am I missing?
The L.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, that one.
And then here we said, let's say 1 fraction, 2 fractions.
You also forgot the semicolon.
Thank you. What happens if I forget the semicolon? It just doesn't, it cancels out everything after the semicolon, will never apply. Okay, so now we have that. So why do we have 3 columns? Sorry, why do we have 3 rows? A little bit louder. I think I heard it here. So we have 3 columns. In total, we have 9 elements. And we're asking the grid to be 3 columns and to have 2 rows. But the third row is created implicitly to put to lay out the rest of the elements that we didn't do. Let's do this one. Let's do like double that. Oh, what happened here? So I have a comma here. If we go to inspect, let's see what's going on with my CSS property. Oh, seems that it's not applying. It says invalid property value. So property values, when you have more than one value, or when a property receives and accepts more than one value, you will separate them by spaces. If you separate them by anything else that's not a space, you invalidate that property and it will not apply. Refresh. Now we have 3 rows. Okay. Questions, comments, concerns, ideas? Yes, John?
So, first is that the number of times you need to repeat it. The repeat doesn't, it won't take it if you have like different measurements.
Correct. You want to repeat something. That's a good point that you bring up. You want to repeat something when it's the same, right? You don't want to repeat. Well, like if you're repeating the same. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't think I'm. Like if you're doing something 3 times, but every time you're doing something different, then you're not really repeating, right? I guess that would be. Let's look at the definition of repeating. So say I gave something one has already said. Do something again either once or a number of times. But I think this something has to be the same thing. Well, I think it can get quite philosophical, but also that actually also brings me this idea. What if we do repeat 2 times? Let's do repeat 2 times. What do you think we're gonna get? It's different. 2 columns, right? And what if I say 100% here? What do you think is going to happen? Or no, not 100. Let's do 2 fractions. I honestly don't know what's going to happen, so let's build discussion. Like the question is, can we mix a repeat with a fixed size? What do you think? Thumbs up if you think yes, that we can mix a repeat with other measurements. Okay. And then thumbs down if you say no, this is going to break. Cool. Okay, so we have some dissent. That's good. Let's save. Let's refresh. And we have 3 columns. Brianna, can you repeat that for the entire class? I think you were explaining it right.
Okay, so the repeat is going to make 2 one fractions. So with the first 2 are going to make the first 2 columns. And then when you're adding another column, you separate it by a space. So you have space 2 fractions there. So that's actually a 3rd column with 2 fractions worth of space.
Great, correct. Mm-hmm. So we're actually here with what appears to be 2 values, the repeat and the other fraction. We're actually creating 3 columns. Okay? Cool. So, okay, so this is all very nice. It would be cool to have some space. If we could add some space between the columns and the rows, maybe we will want a gap. So, very well named. We have another property called grid gap. And give that a value. Try it out. What happens if you give it two different values? So what are some of our findings? If we use pixel, it works. If we use fraction, doesn't work. Let's say that. Wait, say that again. Semicolon? Oh, also that's another thing. For the last rule, you don't have to add a semicolon. My advice is you always add it for the last property value. So if we do 10 pixels, now we have gaps in between that are all 10 pixels. So let's look at it here, container, and then we see that. Okay, and so just like in CSS, some of you might have already realized this, which is you have shorthand for properties. So it turns out that grid gap is a shorthand for grid gap, grid row gap, as well as grid column. So let's do this column gap 10 pixels. Now I can comment this out. I comment out they want just grid gap, and then I refresh, and I still have the same thing, which is both the rows, the row gap, and the column gap will be 10 pixels. So that is to say that grid gap is a shorthand property that will set both at once. So and there's a ton of properties that work just like this. If you think about it, grid template columns and grid template rows, we could also do it if we do grid template. My spelling is grid template. And I forgot the exact syntax. So let's do grid template. Also, just like in JavaScript, all this documentation is out there. Let's look at this one in MDN. The grid template is CSS property. It's a shorthand property for defining grid columns, rows, and areas. So it turns out there is something called areas as well. And this is how we can do it. So it seems that we'll use grid template rows. So this is the rows that we want, and then this separated by a slash will specify the columns that we want. So that's just to again make you aware of the fact that we have in CSS there's a bunch of shorthand properties that you can use. Another one, does anyone know any other that would like to share that is a shorthand property? That sort of like, you can think of it as, you can think of it as under the hood having expanding to others. Neil? A little bit louder. Flex flow, yeah. Right, correct. We can use that's a good one. Any others? Shar?
You do like padding even for numbers. You can also do like padding left, padding right, padding up or down.
Correct. Great example. One more. Michael? Margin. Margin and border was mentioned here as well. You can for those are shorthand properties for border top, left, right, and bottom. Okay, cool. So let's look. We saw that. So let's look at what happens if, or any questions before we see an interesting problem that we have with this grid. Questions, comments? Douglas?
We'd like to go in this way. Is there a way to isolate one div so that it can, like, where one fills the entire row, it pushes 2, 3 out, so the other divs are
on the second column?
Just kind of push down.
Once we get to see how we can place the elements, yes, we can say that one div be occupy the entire column, and then everything will be moved down. That's coming up. But before we have to see this problem that we currently have. Okay, let's go back to grid gap. Let's just set it to the 10 pixels. Gosh, we get that. Okay. But now what happens if we have, let's say, div 5. What happens if div 5 now suddenly has more content inside? Let's look at, where is the lesson here? Here. What if now div 5 or 3 or whatever has this paragraphs there inside? So these paragraphs now live inside of the 5 view. Let's go here. Let's refresh. Oh. Okay. That's good. The div will just grow as necessary. But what if, let me see. Okay, so the problem that I wanted to illustrate will appear if I comment out the, if I comment out the rows. Let's refresh this page. Oh no, that still works. Wait, I have to go look back at my notes. Oh, okay. So I think it jumped a little bit around, but we have one more property that we should see, which is, so I've been talking about the explicit, explicitly defining the grid, its rows and its columns, and the implicit definition of the grid that is made by the browser, right? So let's look at this. So I'm not defining my rows explicitly. Therefore, the browser will make the rest, will make the calculations for me. Actually, let's go back to this. Let me comment this out. We're back here. So the browser is making the rows for me, right? If we have 10 elements, there will be a fourth row made implicitly by the browser. So we could define the height of these rows that are made without them being made explicitly. We could still say, I want the implicit rows to be X height. And we do that with grid auto rows. So this is like the automatic rows that are created implicitly. I want to say, I want them to be 100 pixels. Try this. Remove the grid template rows and give grid auto rows 100 pixels. So I am in this way. Grid auto rows allows me to control the height of those rows that are automatically created, or are also known as implicitly laid out by the browser. I didn't try, but you should try. What happens if you give more than one value to this property? Okay, what did you find? Anyone wants to share what they found? Jonathan? Here overflows? Okay, but I commented the other elements here, just for now. I commented so that we first play with it like this, and see what we get. Yes, Brian?
Start with the second one, check. Add a second.
Mhm.
Added another value.
Okay, like that.
Yeah.
And then once I refresh. So now the second column becomes 2 pixels, 20 pixels high. And then remember that these rows are not being laid out for us, like explicitly by us. They're being laid out automatically for the browser. Now I have a question. What do you think will happen if we have the amount of rows times columns is less than the amount of elements? Like here we have, this is nice because we have 3 rows and 3 columns. In this case, what would happen if I could control to have maybe 2 rows and 2 columns? Now I'll only fit 4 elements. What do you think will happen? Brianna, would you like to share the answer? Or what you think?
So I was thinking that it wouldn't necessarily matter because it's grid auto, so it will automatically adjust and make however many rows to fit the elements.
Mm-hmm. Correct. So what Brianna is suggesting, it wouldn't really matter because the grid will just create as many rows as it needs to fit the entire content. And I am inclined to believe that that's true, but let's verify it. So I'm going to comment this out. I have 3 columns, and we can see that the browser is automatically creating 3 rows, right? Because we have 3 columns. But let's have only 2. So if we have 2 columns, how many rows are we going to get now? 4.5, or maybe 5. Right? And then what if we say here, grid template rows. I want, let's say, just 2 rows. One of 100 pixels and the other one of 50 pixels. So I have, my grid will be a 2 by 2 basically. Let's try it. Refresh. And we get a grid of still 2 by 5, but what we have here, this is another demonstration of implicit versus explicit. Explicitly, we have a 2 by 2 grid defined. Everything else, so basically we explicitly define these 4 squares. So, but everything else is automatically laid out implicitly by the browser. So we said that grid auto rows controls the height of those rows, the rows that are laid out automatically, that are laid out implicitly. So if we uncomment this, oh, this might be interesting to see. We're saying control the, let's just see. Let's do this one like 10 pixels. And let's just try first with one value. So here, let's have a vote here. Do you think the first column is going to be 10 pixels? Do you think, so that's one option. The first column to be, oh wait, did I modify the right thing? No, this one. Would the first column be, the first row be 10 pixels, or the next implicitly laid out row? That is the row of 5 and 6 be 10 pixels. So we have two options. This will either put the 5 and 6, the row containing 5 and 6 be 10 pixels, or the row containing 1 and 2 be 10 pixels. So thumbs up if you think it's going to do row 1 be 10 pixels. Okay, so we have some of you in the room. Now thumbs down if you think it's going to be 5 and 6, 10 pixels. And where is everyone else? Okay, cool. Let's try it out. So the key is why. Cameron?
It doesn't override anything?
It doesn't override anything.
Yeah, so it just keeps going after the first two are fine.
Correct. In other words, grid outer rows affect, and this is something I said, will affect the implicit grid, not the explicit. We said the explicit to be 10 pixels the first row, and the second row to be 50 pixels. So grid outer rows will affect the implicit rows, basically. And in this case, it's affecting them all, making everything that was laid out implicitly be 10 pixels high.
Unless you add another 10.
Maybe. If I do 20 pixels here.
On the gap.
Oh, this is gap now. Save. Oh. Something happened. Let's look. Let's inspect in here. I cannot get this thing. Start, Michael.
I think the font size is too big.
Yeah, just tiny.
Oh, yeah, we can see the small cells. It's really small. Look at this. This is what we're saying. But we can see that. Well, okay, let's try with some bigger numbers. Let's do. Maybe this one be 70 pixels, and this one be 120 pixels. That is a little bit better. So the rows that were not laid out explicitly get the measurement from the grid outer row by default. So what do you think will be like the difference between grid outer row and grid template rows? Anything? No, seriously, you can say anything. Yes. Jonathan. Which one? Grid auto rows tells the browser how to define the rows. I guess we'll need to expand on what you mean by how to lay out the rows. Let's see if anybody else can complement that. Yes, Peter?
When you just put one value in the template rows, it only affects your first row. When you put just one value in your auto rows, it affects all of your rows.
Cool, that's a good one. That's a good difference. We have, when we do grid outer rows, now all of the rows that are laid out implicitly become adopt this height, right? If we do that in here, so this is actually a good segue to the next difference. If we do that in here, what do you think is going to happen? Wait. Can you say that one more time, Peter?
Sure. If you push just one value in the grid template rows, it only affects the first row as opposed to the auto rows affects all the rows. So like, yeah, if you wanted to make one row larger than the rest of the rows, you could affect the first one and then from there on affect all the other ones and give them the same value following whatever you put in the template rows.
Right. So okay. So what we're seeing here is that the first row, by saying grid template row, will be 100 pixels, and everything else will be 70 pixels. All the other ones that are implicitly laid out, and also, okay. Anything else? So this one is a little bit more obscure, but when you're dealing with grid template rows, or when you do a second value, you are explicitly creating another row. But when you do a second value so we can see, I guess like a good example would be, let's create more than the rows that we have here. So actually, let me do another column so that let's just do that. Now I want to create, so we have 5 rows. I want to create 6. So I'm going to do 2 fraction. Oh, let's just do, see, when you're doing something repeatedly, think of repeat. Oh, but I think this will be interesting. I want to do 6 rows of everyone to have 1 fraction. And I misspelled repeat. Like that? REP. Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's see if we have, okay, so you see we have that extra row empty at the end, right? So grid template rows will create rows, basically. Not only dictates their height, but also it creates new rows. If we do that in grid auto rows, so let's disable, let's go back to this one. Just do 1 fraction. And then 2 fractions for the second one. So we still get our 2 by 2 explicit grid. 2 by 2 explicit grid. And then we say I want the implicit height of the rows to be, or I want the height of the implicit rows to be read out of rows to be, let's make them like 200 pixels. So every row that was laid out implicitly now is 200 pixels. But can I create another? Can I create a row with this? So we have 3 implicitly created rows. Let's do more manageable number, 120. So would I be able to do like 120, 120, 120? So now we're saying the implicit rows be 120, and we have, how many implicit rows we have? We have 3, right? This up until we get to the third one. And let's see if that created a new empty row. It didn't. It was just ignoring the last value, or anything basically after the third one. Let's do, so this is for displaying purposes. Let's just make like 50 or 60. Second one 80. The last one 10. So now the first implicitly defined row is 60. The second one implicitly defined row is 80. The third one is 100 pixels. And if we do 200 pixels here, this last value is just being ignored, because there is no such thing as a 6th row. That makes sense? Questions or comments? So again, just to reiterate, grid template rows not only dictate the height of the rows, but also how many rows there are in the grid. It explicitly defines rows in the grid. Grid outer rows do not add rows to the grid, but it does dictate, and it doesn't dictate the height of the explicitly defined rows. What it does, it dictates the height of the implicitly defined rows. And it has no way to create rows on its own. And lastly, we saw that when we have grid outer rows and only one value, that value applies to all the rows that are created implicitly. When we have grid template rows and we have only one value, we're only defining explicitly one row. Questions, concerns, thoughts, ideas that we should try? That's a fair idea. That's thumbs up if you're for that idea. Cool. Let's have a 5-minute break. Actually, let's make it 7 to 10.
Let's make it 10.
You
Yes. No, I win. That just win. No.
Okay, welcome back. We just need to cover a few more things before you can start doing the exit ticket, and that is the following. So, once you have your grid, you may or may not decide to explicitly lay out the rows, right? If we don't say, let's remove the explicitly defining the rows, but I want all of them, all the implicitly defined rows, to be 70 pixels. So here I'm defining two columns, and I'm not defining explicitly the rows. So the browser will just create as many rows as we need to accommodate all the content. And all those rows are being created implicitly, or those rows constitute the implicit grid. And we're saying I want those rows in the implicit grid to be 70 pixels tall. So we get this. All of them become 70 pixels, right? Because all the rows are being laid out implicitly. So what happens if now I go on my HTML and I add a few paragraphs into one of these divs? So I added these paragraphs that I had coming out earlier, and then I'm going to refresh my page, and we get this in our screen. Do P1. I don't know. Just so that we can tell them apart. Now we get this. What is this called again? When the content goes outside of this container, we call it overflow. So why do you think this is happening? I mean,
Because we set the height of the row to 70, the content was more than
correct. So that's because we set the height of the rows of the implicitly created rows to be 70 pixels. But the content of div 5 is taller than that. But we have a fixed height that constrains the element, and it cannot grow. So for this, we have a couple options for fixing this. Is we could explicitly set the rows. If we explicitly set the rows, I'm going to comment that and I say grid template rows. Let's define only 2 rows, or actually we'll need to define 3. So I'm just going to do one fraction, one fraction, one fraction. So I define explicitly 3 rows. Now I refresh. Now we get that. Oh, man. So this now we have our row be as tall as it needs to be to fit all its content. But that's also affecting the top, the first, second row. And the rows after that are being laid out implicitly, therefore they're not affected. So this is interesting. Why? Let's speculate as to why would the first and second row be affected by the height of the third row. And I honestly don't have the answer to that, but we can create some discussion. Yes, Michael.
Let's do the fraction and already
biggest height, and
Mm-hmm.
then kind of makes it 1/3, and the rest are whatever they are, which is 1/3.
I'll say that's a very fair assumption. I think that makes sense since all of them, row 1 and 2, are actually the same height as row 3. So it might be that internally the browser takes in whatever is the tallest element and it says, okay, I'm going to take this as one fraction. I'm going to lay out everything else that says it's one fraction based on this. That's a good one. What if we change this to, let's say, pixels? Let's do 70 pixels, 50 pixels. Actually, let's make it noticeably small. So I'm going to do 50 pixels here, and just for contrast, this one 50 pixels as well. So we have explicitly defining 3 rows, 70 pixels, the first one 50, and 50 the next. Let's refresh. Save, refresh, and we get that. So we still get the same overflow going on. I thought at some point we didn't have the overflow when we defined both the rows and the columns. Would it be because we had? So here I guess it's overflowing because the second row will be 50 pixels. What if we say auto? Oh, but that's the second one. I meant this, the third one. Okay, so that works. So by auto, we don't constrain it. We say grow as much as you need to. So that's one option. If we do one fraction, we probably get the same. But then we saw that if we also put this one fraction, we will probably have the second and third row be the same height. Because even though we haven't verified the assumption, I think it's a fair assumption that the browser will take in the tallest element and make that one fraction and calculate the rest based on that. Okay, so we saw that we have auto. We can use auto to make the row as tall as it needs to be to fit all the content. But wouldn't it be nice if we could say, I want all the implicitly laid out rows to be at least 100 pixels, and if there is one that needs more space, to just automatically create that space for that one, so that we don't have to explicitly say that one will be automatic. So the question is, like, wouldn't it be nice if we could say, I want my rows to be X height, but if there's one that needs more height than that to be automatic, without explicitly saying which one will be that one be. Because imagine in a website, well, since we're the creators of the website, we'll probably know exactly the content, right? But you may be getting a list of items or a list of lists, let's say, from from the internet. And say this is not your content, you're displaying a third-party content. You don't know how tall or small that content is, and you don't know if it's the first list that is going to be taller or the last one. So for addressing that problem, we have a function that is called min max. So actually, let's go back to implicitly, or not defining the rows explicitly, which is this. Now saying all the implicit rows be 70 pixels tall. So we get this overflow, right? We're saying all the implicit rows be 70 pixels tall. And then the question is, can we have the height of whatever row needs more space or more height be automatic instead of just fixed? So for doing that, what we have is a function called min-max, just like the repeat function. And min-max takes in two arguments, very well named, a min and a max. So min-max will say, I want my rows to be at least 70 pixels. That's the minimum. Less or more than or equal to 70 pixels. And less or equal to, let's set a fixed size here. Let's do 10 pixels. So I want my rows to be greater or equal to 70 pixels, but less or equal to 100 pixels. So let's see what we get. Let's refresh. And we get this. Wait, let me just make sure that I didn't. I was expecting. Oh, that's a good point. So I have a bug in my CSS, which is separating the arguments. Thank you. Well, at least we learned that if you don't put a comma, then the rule is probably just ignore. Now if we do that, all of them seem to be the same height, aren't they?
Not for me.
So which one are you having to the, let's do this one 200. Mine are all 200 pixels. Yours are not?
Maybe the comma. Maybe the comma there.
But I have the comma. I need the comma.
I don't have the comma in mine.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, but no, but this is the same as this. This is the same as having nothing. So the comma is, we need the comma actually. But what I want is I want these rows to be 70 pixels.
Oh, is it because you have grid order rows? So you create template?
Yeah, no, I want the outer rows still. Yeah, but so I think let's just take a pick at the min max. But if you do template, you will explicitly defining the rows, which you may not want to do. So here, the min-max function defines a size range greater than or equal to min and less than or equal to max. And then it says each parameter can be a length, a percentage, a flex value, or one of the keyword values: max content, min content, auto. Oh, so it seems that we have this, which might be what we need. And then it says if max is less than min, then max is ignored. Okay, so let's go back here. Let's try to make sense of this. So all of them are okay. So here, what I think is going on is that we're saying all the rows be less or equal to, no, more or equal to 70, but less or equal to 100. But here, because one of them needs more space, then the max just wins. So everything becomes 200 pixels. But what if we change this 200 to be auto? So we say at least be 70 pixels, and at most be automatic. Now we actually have what we want, which is define the height of some columns, and if one of them needs more, it just grows as needed. Let's make this one say 50 pixels just to make sure. Yep. So the min max is takes in two values, a min and a max. It will make that property be equal or greater than the min, but less than or equal than the max. In this case, our max is auto, right? So that is, the max can be as much space as needed by the element. So that behavior that we saw that was confusing must be somewhere explained in here. Oh, let's try this, max content and min content as our max. What do you get? Let's do auto max content. Seems that one works as well. Max content will be as much space as you need to fit all the content. Min content, though, might give us different results, but I'm not sure. Let's try that. Oh, nice. Let's just make sure that our CSS property is still working. Container, yes. So it seems that we found that min and max content will still work. We're not sure exactly as to why. Let's do min content versus max content. How do they work? The smallest size of a box could take that doesn't lead to overflow, that could be avoided by choosing a larger box. And then max content is a box's ideal size in a given axis. When given infinite available space, usually this is small size. Okay, so I'll leave you guys to read more details and see this example. But one seems to be, this min content will be the minimal space that the box needs, which will grow as needed. And then max content seems to be the opposite, which is as much space as it has available. But that will be in context where you have nested boxes like this. Okay, so we saw that we can use min and max to say at least 50 pixels, but not more than the max, which in this case we pick auto. Cool. And that way we can allow some of them. All of them will be 50 pixels, and whoever needs more, it will just be automatic. Okay, so that's the min max, and let's see. Oh, so now let's look at min max with being used in a repeat. So let me here. I want to make. Okay, actually, let's forget about this outer row for now. Let's just comment that out. And here a nice thing will be for us to say, I want my rows to be 30 pixels, or let's say 100 pixels. But if the screen doesn't fit, so let's say I want 4 rows to be 100 pixels. But if the screen doesn't fit 4 rows be 400 pixels, just start to adjust. But I want my columns to still be 100 pixels. So let's do this. I want my so I define one, and I can define a second one, right? Or let's do 200 just to. Right, and here we could say once 2 rows don't fit anymore, resize those. I still want 2, but resize those 2 rows to still fit. Or we can do, well, actually we saw how we could get them to resize. But what if we want them to instead, imagine we have 3. Right? But instead, as soon as the third column doesn't fit anymore, now let's make 2 columns automatically. This was the initial problem that I mentioned about if we had a table, then we'll have to think about when do you no longer fit 3 columns. So that you can make it 2 now, right? The all way of doing this will be for us to like measure exactly where it doesn't fit the third one, and then create a media query that says once the screen reaches that width, then create only 2 instead of 3. Right? But CSS Grid makes that easier. If we look at let's look at repeat. And actually, I think I'm just going to write this one and explain it. So basically, I want to create as many columns as they fit. And I want to do autofill. So this is another value that we can use, autofill. Let's look at that definition real quick. CSS. Oh, also, CSS Tricks has a great article as well on Grid, just like the one in Flexbox. A must read that. So auto-sizing columns in CSS with autofill and autofit. Let's see if they have a quick. These guys don't have a quick definition. Oh, where did it go? Let me look at this. So let's look at this example. In the first example, we use autofill keyword to repeat. We get as many tracks. In this case, tracks is another word that you might find as reading the documentation. And tracks refers to both rows and columns. So we can get as many tracks, or it can refer to both or either of them. We can get as many tracks, in this case, as many columns, I think. With a minimum of 200 pixels and a maximum of 1 fraction is as will fit in the container. In the second example, they are using Autofill keyword for repeat. We get as many tracks with a minimum of 200 pixels and a maximum of one fraction as will fit in the container. So in this case, we see the same. After auto placement, any empty tracks are collapsed to 0. So our items can expand to take up the remaining space. So let's see if this is moving. Okay. So this is basically what we want in our example as well. So if three columns don't fit, I'll make it 2 columns. Right? So okay, so let's do that in here. Now I want to repeat autofill, or as many times as they fit. And then what do I want to repeat? I want to do min max 200 pixels and 1 fraction. And I'm going to close this one. So note here how we want to repeat as many times as they fit. And then what do we want to repeat? So do you guys remember that we did, like, the first version of this that we saw was grid template columns. We did repeat first how many times? 3, let's say. And we want to repeat 1 fraction. So this first line will create 3 columns, each one of 1 fraction. Here we're going to create as many columns as they fit. And how big are those columns going to be? They're going to be more or equal to 200, but less or equal to 1 fraction. So once we have this, we end up actually, I need to expand this. We end up with as many as they fit, basically. And as I increase my zoom, then we currently have 4, but if I increase my zoom, now 4 don't fit. Now we get 3. And that's still true if I resize this. So we see that 3 now, instead of being the last value in the first row, the last column and first row, now becomes the first value in the second row. And that is also, it will also become 1 if we just don't have enough space for even 2. And then it seems that, I guess I kind of go smaller than this on my window. But I wonder if we go in here, and we have this in the mobile phone, we can get quite small. Okay, so just to explain one more time. And here what we're doing is repeating. We remember that the first argument for the repetition is how many times you want to repeat. And here I want to repeat as many times as possible, as they fit. And then what do I want to repeat? In this case, I want to repeat either 200 pixels, something greater or equal to 200 pixels, but less or equal to 1 fraction. So as we can see here, we take in each column will be 200 pixels, but and they will always remain 200 pixels, but once we don't get anything that fits anymore, cannot see it, we will get 1 fraction. questions or comments, thoughts, and all that? This one is quite a mouthful. The repeat, the autofill, and the min and max. In that case, once we have this, we don't have to worry about where is it that no longer 3 columns fit that we have to break, but the grid will do it for us. Cool. Also, I wanted to recommend to you this YouTube channel called Layout Land. It has great explanations for everything we have seen here, about grid, about even Flexbox that we saw yesterday, and is by this lady, I forgot her name, Jean Simmons, I think, and she's a web designer at Mozilla. She is also part of the committee that works on making CSS, basically the rules by which CSS works. So she's super knowledgeable. Say that again?
Where?
At Mozilla. The Mozilla, the people that create the Mozilla Firefox browser, and they are part of the community that create CSS. Cool. So anything else? Oh, yes. The last part that we need. I guess we're not gonna get to see the exit ticket today, but this one is quick, which is what Douglas mentioned. Where can we say one item to be from one row to or occupy one row, or occupy 2 cells in the first row and 2 cells in the second row. So for that, we have, let's go back here. For that, we have, let me remove this. So, okay, so for doing that, we will need to, we won't specify, if we want this element to occupy the entire row, we won't specify that in the container. We'll specify it in the actual element, in the grid item. So we have the grid container is our container, right? And our grid item is this div that we have here. The divs are children, direct children of the grid container. So here what we can say is, we can specify grid row. Let's do grid row 2. Let's see what this gives us. Said, oh, but I need to, if I say grid row 2, but this is going to apply to all of them. And I don't want to put all of them on grid 2, but actually let's try it out. Let's see what we get. Grid row 2. Now we put all of them in grid row 2, right? But that might not be what we want. So let's pick up one. So I want to do, grab the first one. I know that it has an ID of 1, I think. Yeah, 1. And I want that one. So actually, let me say, refresh, close this. So I'm grabbing the first one, and I'm going to say grid row be equal to 2. Save. Refresh.
I was just wondering,
Uh-huh.
you only have to say display it once, and
Here.
Display grid.
Yes, only once. You do it in the container. Everything that is a child, that container becomes a grid item. But yes, you only say display grid in the container. But here we can say that the first one now is appearing in the second row, because I said, okay, you with ID 1 is going to go in row 2. I could also specify the column, grid column 3. Oh, actually, we don't have that column. Column 2. Now 1 is in grid row 2, grid column 2. And actually, these are, I made a mistake, which is, these are not the actual rows and columns, these are the lines. So it's not that the one element is in row 2, is that the one element will be put after the line 2. And if we, so this is line 1 is here, line 2 is here, then line 3 is here, and then line 4 is here. Basically, between separating the elements, we can have an imaginary lines. Actually, let me show you those lines in Firefox. Container, grid, and then display line numbers. So you see, this is here, line 1, then we have line 2, line 3, and we don't have line 4. Oh, so here we actually have just one line, not 2 as I initially said. So we have line 1, line 2, line 3. And then by saying to the one element to start in row line 2, that's this guy here, and grid column line 2, it ends up being right here in the middle. Cool. So questions regarding positioning the elements in the grid. You can basically specify where you want them. So the last thing that we need to see is how can we make them span more than one column or more than one row? Let me reduce the zoom here so we have those. So what we can do that is with a slash. So let's say I want my element 1 to be after line 2, after column 2, and span to column 3 or line 3. Oops. Column 2 to column 3. Huh. Grid row 2, grid column. Let's see, maybe my CSS is not applying it. Yep.
The second number is where it stops.
The second number is where it stops.
I think so.
Let me just grab it here. So let's just play with this number here. But let's see, let's do 1. Oh. Okay, so say that one more time, Peter.
That's like where it stops.
The second number.
Go up until that one, but not include. So try 1 to 4.
Right, so the second number is the line where it stops. by default, if it starts on line 1, it will end in line 2. Right? If we want to go one more, we want to start to end in line 3. And then that will have the effect of spanning those 2 columns. From line 1, by default, we'll end in line 2. So we say, now end in line 3. And then that gives us the ability to do that. And if we do 4, now it turns out that 1 occupies the entire row, basically. So that we could do that. Let's have it also here before we go. So line 2 to line 3. And then now we have it occupying this chunk. Right, so can we see how with this, then we get a ton of flexibility as to where we put our content, and also the power of having everything in a grid that will allow us to put our content basically anywhere we want and with any dimensions that we want. Cool. Any departing questions, comments? We're gonna get to the exit ticket tomorrow as we come in. Tomorrow we're just going to be working in the lab, which, as I said, it includes a game like Flexbox Froggy, but now for the grid. It's called Grid Garden, and we're gonna be working basically on that. Yeah. Do you have any other questions? I'm gonna stay after for a little bit. Thank you.